I need to get this out before I lose my mind. What just happened feels like something out of a nightmare, except I've been preparing for this exact moment for the past 4 years. My family has always treated me like garbage. I'm 28, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the family disappointment. My dad, Carl, works construction and thinks I'm soft because I went to college instead of learning a trade. My mom, Tiffany, has made it clear since I was a teenager that my older brother, Cash, and sister, Audrey, are her favorites. Cash is 31, married with 2 kids, works at the same construction company as Dad. Audrey is 29, married to some finance guy, lives in the suburbs with their perfect little life. Then there's me, single, no kids, living in a one-bedroom apartment across town. The golden child treatment started when I was about 15. Cash got arrested for drunk driving, and somehow that became my fault, because I should have been watching him at the party. Audrey failed out of her first year of college, and Mom spent months telling anyone who would listen how I was the reason she was distracted and couldn't focus on her studies. Every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday became an opportunity for them to remind me how I never measured up. My grandfather, Sidney, was different, though. He owned a small trucking business and some rental properties around town. While my parents were busy worshiping Cash and Audrey, Grandpa actually listened when I talked about my plans for the future. He helped me with college applications, drove me to interviews when my parents were too busy with my siblings' drama. When I graduated with my business degree, he was the only family member who showed up to the ceremony. But here's the thing that really sealed my fate with my family. Grandpa started asking me for advice about his business decisions. He'd call me up, ask what I thought about buying new trucks or raising rent on his properties. My parents hated this. They thought Grandpa was getting senile, that I was manipulating him somehow. Cash would make jokes about me being Grandpa's little pet. Audrey would roll her eyes whenever Grandpa mentioned something I'd suggested. The breaking point came 4 years ago. Grandpa had a stroke and was in the hospital for 3 weeks. I was there every single day after work, helping him with physical therapy, bringing him books, just talking. My parents visited maybe 5 times total. Cash and Audrey showed up twice each, stayed for 20 minutes, and spent the whole time talking about their own problems. When Grandpa got out of the hospital, he was different, weaker, but also more determined about certain things. He started talking about making sure his affairs were in order. My parents suddenly became very interested in his well-being. Mom started calling him every day, bringing him casseroles, offering to help with errands. Dad began stopping by his house multiple times a week, always finding little repairs that needed to be done. But Grandpa saw right through it. He told me privately that he knew exactly what they were doing, and it disgusted him. He'd spent decades watching them ignore me while praising my siblings for doing the absolute minimum. He said he was tired of enabling their behavior. That's when I started getting suspicious about their sudden interest in family togetherness. Cash began inviting me to family dinners again after barely speaking to me for years. Audrey started asking about my job, pretending to care about my life. My parents would make comments about how important family is, how we all need to stick together. I knew they were planning something. The way they'd stop talking when I walked into rooms, the little glances they'd share when Grandpa mentioned his will. I could feel them plotting, but I had no idea how far they were willing to go. So I started preparing too. I documented every family interaction, kept records of who visited Grandpa and when, saved screenshots of the cruel text messages they'd send me after family gatherings where they thought I'd embarrassed them somehow. I opened a separate bank account and started saving every penny I could. I researched lawyers, read about estate law, learned everything I could about wills and inheritance. Most importantly, I made sure to maintain my relationship with Grandpa without letting my family know how close we'd become. They thought I was just the dutiful grandson doing his obligation. They had no idea that Grandpa and I talked almost every day, that he'd started consulting me on major business decisions, that he'd been telling me for months how proud he was of the man I'd become. Which brings me to today. I got a text from Mom this morning saying there was a family emergency and I needed to come to their house immediately. The message felt weird, too urgent, too vague. But I went anyway because I figured it was finally time for whatever they'd been planning. I walked into their living room and saw the whole family sitting there like some kind of tribunal. Dad, Mom, Cash, Audrey, even my Aunt Kate, who never comes to family stuff. They had papers spread out on the coffee table and this energy in the room that felt like they'd been rehearsing something. Dad stood up the moment I walked in, holding this folder of documents. He told me to sit down, that we needed to discuss my future in the family. The way he said it made my skin crawl, but I sat down anyway. That's when Mom started talking about how they'd all been discussing the situation with Grandpa's will. She said they'd realized there might be some unfairness in how things were set up, and they wanted to make sure everyone was treated equally. Cash jumped in, talking about how inheritance can tear families apart, how they wanted to prevent any future conflicts. I just sat there listening to them build up to whatever they were really planning. Audrey started going on about how she and Cash have children to think about, how they have mortgages and expenses that I don't understand. Dad mentioned how Grandpa might not be thinking clearly anymore, how age can affect people's judgment. Then Aunt Kate, who I hadn't spoken to in probably 2 years, started talking about family values and doing what's right for everyone. The whole thing felt so rehearsed, so calculated. They were all taking turns making their little speeches while I sat there knowing exactly where this was heading. Finally, Dad got to the point. He said they'd consulted with a lawyer and found a way to restructure Grandpa's will that would be more fair to everyone. He pushed the papers across the table toward me and told me I needed to sign a document removing myself from any inheritance claims. And that's when they showed their true colors. Mom actually smiled when she told me that they'd voted unanimously and I would be getting nothing. Cash started laughing about how I'd probably been counting on inheriting Grandpa's house, and now I'd have to figure out my own life. Audrey waved the legal papers around, talking about how even Grandpa would agree that I'm worthless compared to them. The worst part was how much they were enjoying it. Dad threw the pen at my feet and told me to sign or they'd forge my signature anyway. Aunt Kate started counting out loud how much money they'd each get from my share. Mom actually tore up what she claimed was the old will right in front of me. They were all laughing and celebrating while they waited for me to break down or beg or get angry. They wanted me to fight them, to give them a reason to throw me out of the family completely. Instead, I picked up the pen and signed every single document they put in front of me. I looked at each one of them and said, "Congratulations, you won." Then I stood up and walked out while they were still celebrating their victory. I got to my car and drove home, and exactly 10 minutes later, my phone started going absolutely insane. First, it was Mom screaming something about another lawyer showing up at their house, then Cash calling and hanging up when I didn't answer, then Audrey sending frantic text messages asking what the hell is going on. But the call that really got my attention was Dad, and his voice sounded completely different than it had an hour earlier. He kept asking about a second will, demanding to know what I knew about it. The thing is, I haven't answered any of their calls yet. I'm sitting here watching my phone blow up with increasingly desperate messages while I figure out exactly how I want to handle what comes next. Because the truth is, I've been waiting 4 years for this exact moment, and they have absolutely no idea what they just signed themselves up for. Update 1 coming soon. You're not going to believe what that second lawyer told them. Update 1. The comments on my last post were incredible, and several of you guessed exactly what was happening. You're going to love this update. So I left you hanging with my phone exploding after I signed away my inheritance rights and walked out of that family ambush. I decided to let them sweat for about 2 hours before I answered any calls, and by then, they were absolutely losing it. The first call I took was from Mom, and she was not the same smug woman who had been celebrating my downfall a few hours earlier. She was practically hyperventilating, demanding to know what I knew about a second will and why there was another lawyer involved. I played dumb and asked what she meant, which made her even more frantic. She kept saying that this other lawyer showed up at their house right after I left, asking to speak with the family about grandfather Sidney's estate planning. Apparently, this lawyer, who none of them had ever seen before, had documents proving that Grandpa had created a completely separate will just 6 months ago, and according to this new will, everything they thought they knew about the inheritance was wrong. Here's where it gets good. Remember how I mentioned that I'd been preparing for this moment for 4 years? Well, part of that preparation involved having very long, very detailed conversations with Grandpa about what he really wanted to happen with his estate. And what Grandpa wanted was to make sure the people who actually cared about him got rewarded, while the people who only showed up when they smelled money got exactly what they deserved. The second lawyer explained to my family that Grandpa had been watching their behavior very carefully over the past few years. Every fake visit, every calculated casserole delivery, every transparent attempt to get back in his good graces had been noted and documented. Grandpa wasn't senile or confused. He was testing them, and they failed spectacularly. But here's the part that really sent them into panic mode. The new will didn't just redistrict the inheritance. It included specific provisions that made their little signing ceremony completely meaningless. You can't force someone to sign away rights to something they don't actually have rights to in the first place. After Mom's call, Cash tried calling me 6 times in a row. When I finally answered, he was furious but also clearly terrified. He started yelling about how I'd manipulated Grandpa somehow, how I'd poisoned him against the family. I let him rant for about 10 minutes before I calmly explained that Grandpa had made his own decisions based on how each of us had treated him over the years. Cash tried to argue that they'd all been visiting Grandpa regularly, helping him with things around the house, being good grandchildren. I reminded him that I had documentation of every single visit, including dates, times, and duration. Most of their visits lasted less than 30 minutes and usually involved asking Grandpa for money or complaining about their own problems. That's when Cash's tone changed completely. He started trying to negotiate with me, saying that families should stick together, that we could work something out that would be fair to everyone. He reminded me about his kids, about how much he and his wife needed the money for their mortgage. He actually had the nerve to suggest that since I don't have children, I don't understand what real financial pressure feels like. I told him that maybe he should have thought about that before spending the last 4 years treating me like garbage and trying to manipulate an elderly man who had already been generous to all of us over the years. Cash got quiet for a minute and then asked exactly what Grandpa had told me about his plans. This is where I started revealing just how much Grandpa and I had actually been talking. See, my family assumed that my relationship with Grandpa was just me being the dutiful grandson, visiting occasionally and helping with small tasks. They had no idea that Grandpa had been calling me almost every day for the past 2 years, not just for business advice, but because I was the only family member who listened to him without an agenda. Grandpa had told me in detail about every conversation he'd had with my parents, every visit from Cash and Audrey, every transparent attempt to influence his estate planning. He was hurt by how fake they were being, but he was also angry about how they'd treated me my entire life. He'd watched them ignore my accomplishments while celebrating my siblings for doing the absolute minimum, and it disgusted him. Cash started getting aggressive again when he realized how much I knew about their tactics. He accused me of recording conversations with Grandpa, of manipulating a sick old man for my own benefit. He said I was a pathetic loser who couldn't make it on my own, so I had to scheme my way into an inheritance. That's when I reminded Cash about the time 3 years ago when he asked Grandpa for $15,000 to buy a new truck, promising to pay it back within 6 months. Or the time Audrey needed money for her wedding and Grandpa gave her $12,000 as a gift. Or the countless times my parents had borrowed money from Grandpa over the years for various emergencies that never seemed to get paid back. I asked Cash to name one single time in the past 5 years when he'd visited Grandpa Bora without asking for money or a favor. He couldn't answer that. Then Audrey called, and she tried a completely different approach. She was crying, talking about how confused and scared she was, how she couldn't understand what was happening. She said she'd always thought we were a close family, that she loved me and wanted to work things out. She begged me to explain what was going on so they could fix whatever had gone wrong. I almost felt bad for her until I remembered the way she'd been laughing and waving those legal documents around just a few hours earlier. I reminded her about that, about how excited she'd been to tell me I was worthless, about how she'd celebrated dividing up my share of the inheritance. Audrey tried to claim that she'd just been going along with what everyone else wanted, that she'd never personally wanted to hurt me. She said Mom and Dad had convinced her that this was the best thing for the family, that it would prevent future conflicts. She swore that she'd tried to defend me during their planning meetings. I asked her why she didn't call me privately to warn me about what they were planning if she really disagreed with it. She didn't have an answer for that either. The conversation that really got to me was with Dad later that evening. He was different than the others, not panicked or angry, just tired. He admitted that they'd all underestimated me, that they'd thought I was just the quiet kid who would go along with whatever the family decided. He said he was proud of how I'd handled myself, even though he was angry about the situation. Dad explained that they'd been genuinely worried about fairness in the inheritance. He and Mom both felt like Grandpa had been favoring me unfairly, giving me more attention and consideration than Cash and Audrey. They thought the new will arrangement would level the playing field and make sure everyone got treated equally. I told Dad that equal treatment would have been great if it had started 30 years ago when I was growing up. I reminded him about every time he'd chosen Cash's baseball games over my academic competitions, every time he'd praised Audrey for getting a C while ignoring my A's, every family dinner where my accomplishments got mentioned in passing while my siblings' achievements got celebrated with toasts. Dad was quiet for a long time before he admitted that they probably hadn't always been fair to me. He said they'd always assumed I was more independent, that I didn't need as much support and attention as Cash and Audrey. He thought I was tougher, that I could handle being overlooked because I was more capable of taking care of myself. That conversation actually hurt more than all the yelling and manipulation attempts from the others, because Dad was being honest about how they'd justified treating me differently my whole life, and hearing it laid out so plainly made me realize how deep this pattern went. But the part that really validated everything I'd been feeling came when Dad asked what Grandpa had actually said about each of them. I told him about some of the conversations Grandpa and I had shared, about how disappointed Grandpa was in all of them, about how he'd specifically said that Cash had never grown up and Audrey had never learned to think for herself. Grandpa had been particularly critical of my parents, saying that they'd raised children who only cared about themselves and had never learned the value of hard work or genuine relationships. He'd told me that watching them try to manipulate him over the past few years had been one of the most disappointing experiences of his life. By the end of the day, I'd talk to each family member for at least an hour, listening to their panic, their anger, their attempts to negotiate, and their desperate tries to understand what had gone wrong with their perfect plan. None of them asked how I was doing or whether I was hurt by what they'd put me through. They were all completely focused on the money and how this new situation affected them. But here's the thing that's really going to blow your minds. This second will that's got them all panicked, that's just the beginning of what Grandpa and I plan together. There's a reason I've been documenting everything for 4 years. There's a reason I opened that separate bank account and learned everything I could about estate law. And there's a reason I was so calm when they sprung their little ambush on me. The papers they made me sign today weren't just meaningless. They actually helped me in ways they can't even imagine yet. Update 2. Coming tomorrow. Wait until you hear about what those documents they forced me to sign actually accomplished. Update 2. You guys are absolutely killing me with these comments. Some of you have figured out exactly what's happening here, and I'm blown away by how smart this community is. Time for the next piece of this puzzle. So yesterday, I left you hanging about how those documents my family forced me to sign actually helped me instead of hurting me. Well, buckle up, because this is where Grandpa Sidney's planning gets absolutely brilliant. The family spent all night yesterday calling each other, trying to figure out what went wrong with their perfect plan. I know this because Cash called me at midnight, completely drunk, rambling about how they'd had everything figured out and now nothing made sense. He kept asking what tricks I'd learned in college, like business school, taught me how to manipulate inheritance law or something. But the real fun started this morning when their lawyer called them for an emergency meeting. Remember, they'd hired their own lawyer to help them draft those documents that would remove me from Grandpa's will. Well, turns out their lawyer needed to explain some things about what they'd actually accomplished. Mom called me around 10 in the morning and she sounded like she'd been crying for hours. She told me that their lawyer had just informed them that by forcing me to sign those documents under what could be considered duress, they'd actually created evidence of elder abuse and inheritance manipulation. See, here's what Grandpa and I figured out during all those conversations over the past 2 years. If they tried to pressure me into signing away inheritance rights, especially by ambushing me and using emotional manipulation, they would be proving exactly the kind of behavior that Grandpa wanted to protect against. The documents they made me sign weren't just meaningless. They were evidence. Evidence that they were willing to use family pressure, emotional blackmail, and legal intimidation to get what they wanted. Evidence that they saw me as someone who could be pushed around and manipulated. Evidence that their concern wasn't about fairness but about control. Grandpa had anticipated this exact scenario. He knew that if they ever tried to force me out of the inheritance, they would do it in a way that revealed their true character. And he made sure that when they did, it would work against them instead of for them. But here's the part that really sent them into a tailspin. Their lawyer explained that the second will included specific language about any attempts to coerce or manipulate inheritance decisions. If any family member tried to pressure another family member into signing away their rights, that person would automatically forfeit their own inheritance claims. Mom was sobbing on the phone, asking how I could let this happen to the family. She kept saying that they'd raised me better than this, that I was supposed to care about my siblings and their children. She reminded me about all the times the family had supported me growing up, all the sacrifices they'd made for my education. I asked her to be specific about those sacrifices since I distinctly remembered paying for most of my college myself through student loans and work-study programs. I reminded her about the time I asked for help with textbook money, and she told me that if education was really important to me, I'd find a way to pay for it myself. That's when Mom shifted tactics and started talking about how hurt Grandpa would be if he knew we were fighting like this. She said family was the most important thing to him, that he'd want us to work together and support each other. She begged me to think about what he would really want instead of focusing on legal technicalities. I told her that I'd spent 4 years having detailed conversations with Grandpa about exactly what he wanted, and family harmony based on manipulation and intimidation wasn't it. Grandpa had been very clear that he wanted his estate to go to people who had actually earned it through genuine care and respect, not people who showed up when they smelled money. Cash tried a different approach when he called later. He attempted to frame this whole thing as me being vindictive and petty, holding grudges about childhood stuff that didn't matter anymore. He said that everyone goes through difficult periods with their family, but adults learn to move past it and focus on what's really important. I reminded Cash about his wedding 3 years ago, when he specifically asked me not to bring a date because he didn't want his wedding photos to include any of my weird college friends, or the time he told his kids that Uncle Me was too busy with work to come to their birthday parties, even though he'd never actually invited me to any of them. Cash got defensive and said those were just normal family dynamics, that I was being oversensitive about things that weren't intended to hurt me. He insisted that they'd all always loved me and supported me. They just expressed it differently than I expected. That conversation really highlighted how completely they'd rewritten history in their own minds. Cash genuinely seemed to believe that ignoring me for years, excluding me from family events, and treating my accomplishments as less important than my siblings was just normal sibling rivalry. But the call that really showed me how deep this went was with Audrey later that afternoon. She was panicking because she just talked to her husband about their financial situation, and apparently they'd been counting on inheritance money to pay off some significant debts. Audrey admitted that they'd been living above their means for the past few years, assuming that Grandpa's money would eventually help them get back on track. Her husband had been encouraging her to maintain a closer relationship with Grandpa specifically because of the inheritance potential. She begged me to understand that they weren't bad people, they were just struggling and had made some poor financial decisions. She said her kids deserved to grow up in a nice house with good schools, and that inheritance money was supposed to secure their future. I pointed out that maybe she should have thought about her kids' future before treating their uncle like garbage for the past decade. Maybe she should have considered building genuine relationships instead of transactional ones based on what she could get from people. Audrey started crying and said she didn't understand why I was being so cruel, that this wasn't the person she remembered me being. She said I used to be kind and forgiving, that I always tried to keep the peace in the family. That really got to me because she was right about who I used to be. I had been the peacekeeper, the one who absorbed everyone else's bad behavior and tried to smooth things over. I'd spent years making excuses for their treatment of me, convincing myself that they didn't mean to be hurtful. That family was worth preserving regardless of how it felt. But 4 years of watching them fake concern for Grandpa while planning to cut me out had changed something fundamental in how I saw all of them. I'd realized that their version of family was only valuable to them when it served their purposes. The conversation that really drove this home was with Dad that evening. He was calmer than the others, but I could tell he was furious underneath. He asked me directly what I wanted from them, what it would take to resolve this situation in a way that worked for everyone. I told him that what I wanted was for them to acknowledge how they'd treated me over the years and take responsibility for their behavior. I wanted them to admit that their sudden interest in Grandpa's well-being had been motivated by money, not genuine care. Dad was quiet for a long time before he said that maybe they hadn't always handled things perfectly, but that didn't mean they deserved to be punished financially for the rest of their lives. He said that everyone makes mistakes in relationships, but family should be about forgiveness and moving forward together. I asked him if he thought I deserved to be punished for their mistakes when they tried to force me out of the inheritance. I asked him if their willingness to cut me out completely had been about forgiveness and moving forward together. Dad admitted that the inheritance plan hadn't been his idea initially, that Mom and Cash had convinced him it was necessary to prevent future family conflicts. He said they'd been worried that favoritism in the will would tear the family apart, so they'd decided to level the playing field. But when I pressed him about why leveling the playing field meant I got nothing, instead of everyone getting equal shares, he couldn't give me a straight answer. He kept talking around the issue, mentioning my siblings' children and mortgages and financial responsibilities that I didn't have. Finally, I told him that the real issue wasn't the money. It was what their willingness to gang up on me revealed about how they'd always seen me. I was the family member who could be sacrificed for everyone else's benefit, the one whose feelings didn't matter as much, the one who was expected to absorb unfairness for the greater good. Dad got quiet again before asking what Grandpa had actually said about all of them. I told him about some of the more specific conversations Grandpa and I had shared over the past 2 years, about how disappointed Grandpa was in the people his children and grandchildren had become. Grandpa had been particularly bothered by how they treated family relationships like business transactions, always calculating what they could get from each interaction instead of focusing on genuine connection. He'd watch them fake interest in his stories, pretend to care about his health, and manufacture affection whenever they needed something from him. But what really bothered Grandpa was watching them exclude me from family events while expecting me to be available whenever they needed help with something. He'd seen how they celebrated my siblings' mediocre achievements while ignoring my actual accomplishments, and it had made him furious. By the end of that conversation, Dad finally admitted that they'd probably made some serious mistakes in how they'd handled both me and Grandpa over the years. He said he was starting to understand why Grandpa had made the decisions he did, even though Dad didn't like the consequences. But here's the thing that's really going to blow your minds about all of this. Everything I've told you so far, the second will, the documents they forced me to sign, even the inheritance drama itself, that's still just the setup for what Grandpa and I really planned. Because while they've been panicking about losing their inheritance money, they have no idea about the other ways their behavior is about to catch up with them. Update 3. Coming tomorrow. Wait until you hear about what else Grandpa documented over the past 4 years. Final update. This is it, guys. The final piece of the puzzle that shows just how thoroughly Grandpa Sydney planned this whole thing. Your comments have been incredible throughout this journey, and several of you called exactly how this would end. So I left you hanging about what else Grandpa had documented over the past 4 years. Well, it turns out that Grandpa wasn't just watching their behavior around inheritance planning. He was systematically documenting every single interaction he had with each family member, creating a comprehensive record of their true characters. The revelation started when their lawyer called for another emergency meeting yesterday morning. Apparently, the second will included provisions for something called a family conduct review, where detailed documentation of each person's behavior toward Grandpa would be made available to the entire extended family and their social community. Mom called me absolutely hysterical after that meeting. She'd just learned that Grandpa had been keeping detailed journals for the past 4 years, recording every conversation, every visit, every request for money, and every example of them treating me poorly in his presence. These weren't just casual notes. They were dated, detailed accounts that painted a very specific picture of who they really were. But here's the part that sent them into complete panic mode. Grandpa had arranged for copies of these journals to be sent to every single person in their social circle if they tried to contest the will or manipulate the inheritance process. Their church congregation, their work colleagues, their neighbors, their kids' schools. Everyone they interacted with regularly would receive detailed documentation of their behavior. The journals included specific entries about things like Cash asking Grandpa for money to buy a boat while complaining that I was too selfish to help with family expenses. Or Audrey telling Grandpa that she was worried about my mental stability because I didn't have a girlfriend, right after she'd told me at a family dinner that no woman would ever want to put up with my weird personality. Mom was sobbing on the phone, begging me to understand that people would take those stories out of context, that it would ruin their reputations in the community. She kept saying that Grandpa had been confused about family dynamics, that he didn't understand the difference between sibling teasing and actual cruelty. I reminded her about the time 2 years ago when I got promoted at work, and she told Grandpa that she was concerned I was becoming arrogant and forgetting where I came from. According to Grandpa's notes, she'd also mentioned that my success was probably going to my head and making me think I was better than the rest of the family. Mom tried to claim she'd been worried about me becoming isolated from family, that she'd only wanted Grandpa to encourage me to stay connected with everyone. But Grandpa's journal entry about that conversation included her exact words about how my education had made me think I was too good for people who worked with their hands. Cash called me later that morning, and he was furious in a way I'd never heard before. He'd apparently spent the night reading through copies of Grandpa's journal entries that their lawyer had provided, and he was realizing how much Grandpa had been paying attention to things Cash thought he'd gotten away with. One entry detailed the time Cash had told Grandpa that I was probably gay because I didn't talk about dating women, and that maybe that's why I was so focused on school instead of normal guy stuff. Another entry described Cash laughing about how I'd never be able to handle a real job because I'd been protected by academic environments my whole life. Cash tried to argue that those conversations had been private family discussions, that Grandpa shouldn't have been documenting personal conversations without telling people. He said it felt like a violation of trust, like Grandpa had been spying on them instead of just being a normal grandfather. I asked Cash if he thought it was normal for family members to spend private conversations tearing down relatives who weren't there to defend themselves. I reminded him about all the times he'd made jokes about my appearance, my career choices, and my social life, assuming that Grandpa would find his humor entertaining. Cash got defensive and said that teasing was just how families showed affection, that I was being oversensitive about normal sibling dynamics. He insisted that he'd never meant to hurt my feelings, that everything he'd said had been meant as brotherly ribbing that I should have been able to handle. But then I started reading him some of the specific quotes from Grandpa's journals, word for word, accounts of conversations where Cash had been genuinely cruel, rather than playfully teasing. Like the time he told Grandpa that I was the kind of person who would end up alone because I was too weird for normal people to relate to. Cash went quiet when he realized how his words sounded when they were written down and read back to him. He asked how many people were going to see those journal entries. And when I told him that Grandpa had arranged for them to be distributed to anyone who might be affected by their behavior, Cash started panicking about his job and his kids' school. The conversation with Audrey was even worse. She'd discovered that Grandpa had documented several conversations where she'd specifically tried to turn him against me by suggesting that my relationship with him was unhealthy and manipulative. According to Grandpa's notes, Audrey had told him that she was worried I was taking advantage of his generosity, and that my frequent visits were probably motivated by inheritance expectations rather than genuine care. She'd also suggested that Grandpa's preference for my company over my siblings was creating family tensions that could be avoided if he encouraged me to be more independent. Audrey was crying throughout our entire conversation, insisting that she'd only been trying to protect Grandpa from being manipulated. She said she genuinely believed that my close relationship with him was unfair to Cash and their parents, who had their own responsibilities and couldn't visit as often as I did. I asked her to explain how protecting Grandpa from manipulation involved trying to convince him that I didn't really care about him. I reminded her about the specific conversation where she'd told Grandpa that college had probably taught me how to manipulate older people for financial gain. Audrey claimed that she'd been worried about appearances, that people in town were starting to talk about how much time I spent with Grandpa and whether that was appropriate for someone my age. She said she'd been trying to help me avoid gossip and social judgment, but Grandpa's journal entries revealed that Audrey had been the one spreading those concerns around town, telling neighbors and church friends that she was worried about Grandpa's relationship with me. She'd been actively creating the social pressure she claimed to be protecting me from. The conversation that really drove home how deep this documentation went was with Dad that evening. He'd spent the entire day reading through 4 years of detailed journal entries, and he was finally understanding how their behavior had looked to someone who had been paying careful attention. Dad admitted that seeing their family dynamics written down in black and white had been shocking. He said he'd never realized how consistently they'd all participated in undermining me, or how obvious their money-focused motivations had been to someone outside their immediate group planning. But what really got to Dad was reading Grandpa's analysis of their parenting choices over the years. Grandpa had documented specific examples of them celebrating Cash and Audrey's mediocre achievements while dismissing my actual accomplishments. And he'd written detailed observations about how that pattern had affected family relationships. Dad tried to argue that parenting decisions were complicated, that they'd been trying to build confidence in kids who needed more encouragement, while assuming I was self-motivated enough to succeed without constant praise. He said they'd thought I was more resilient and independent than my siblings. I asked Dad if he thought resilience meant accepting unfair treatment without complaining, or if independence meant not deserving the same level of family support as everyone else. I reminded him about graduation ceremonies they'd missed, achievements they'd barely acknowledged, and celebrations where my success had been mentioned as an afterthought. Dad was quiet for a long time before admitting that they'd probably used my competence as an excuse to focus their attention on Cash and Audrey, who had always demanded more immediate intervention. He said they'd assumed I would understand that different kids needed different types of support. But then I read him some of Grandpa's specific observations about their behavior, including detailed accounts of them actively discouraging Grandpa from being proud of my achievements, because it might make my siblings feel bad about themselves. The entries included conversations where Mom had asked Grandpa not to mention my job promotion at family dinners because Cash was struggling with work stress, or times when Dad had suggested that Grandpa's praise for my academic success was making Audrey feel bad about her own college struggles. Dad realized that their pattern hadn't been about giving different kids different support. It had been about consistently prioritizing my siblings' emotional comfort over my right to family recognition and celebration. But here's the part that really completed Grandpa's revenge plan. The journal entries weren't just being distributed to their immediate social circle. Grandpa had arranged for copies to be sent to specific people who could make professional and social consequences feel very real. Cash's boss received detailed documentation of conversations where Cash had complained about having to work with people who didn't share his family values, while simultaneously describing those values as excluding family members who didn't meet certain standards. Audrey's church group received journal entries showing her pattern of gossiping about family members and spreading concerns about people's character and motivations without factual basis. My parents' neighbors and friends received documentation of their discussions about manipulating an elderly family member's estate planning and their willingness to exclude a family member to benefit themselves financially. The beauty of Grandpa's plan was that everything in those journals was completely true and documented in their own words. They couldn't claim he'd misunderstood or misrepresented anything because he'd been meticulously careful about recording exactly what they'd said and done. When the full scope of the documentation became clear, each family member tried one last desperate conversation with me. But instead of taking responsibility for their behavior, they all focused on trying to minimize the damage to their reputations and relationships. Mom begged me to help them retrieve the journal copies before more people read them, promising that they'd learned their lesson and would treat me better in the future. Cash offered to split his remaining inheritance with me if I could somehow stop the distribution process. Audrey suggested that we could all go to family therapy together to work through these issues privately. But none of them actually apologized for how they'd treated me over the years. None of them acknowledged that their behavior toward Grandpa had been manipulative and selfish. None of them showed any understanding of why their actions had consequences that extended beyond just losing money. Dad was the only one who came close to real accountability when he admitted that they'd created a family dynamic where I was consistently undervalued and excluded, and that Grandpa had been right to document the pattern for others to see. The final piece of Grandpa's plan was a letter he'd written specifically to me, explaining that he'd watched my family treat me poorly for my entire life and had decided that someone needed to stand up for the person I'd become despite their behavior. Grandpa wrote that he'd been proud of how I'd handled their treatment with dignity and continued success, but that he was tired of watching them benefit from having a family member they could consistently undervalue and exclude when it was convenient. He wanted me to understand that the inheritance was never really about money. It was about creating consequences for people who had spent decades taking advantage of someone's good nature and willingness to absorb unfair treatment for the sake of family peace. The letter ended with Grandpa telling me that he hoped I would use his example to understand that people who truly care about you don't require you to accept poor treatment to maintain relationships with them. It's been a week since the journal distribution, and the social consequences have been everything Grandpa planned. Cash lost a promotion opportunity when his boss decided his family values didn't align with company culture. Audrey's church friends have been asking pointed questions about her character and judgment. My parents have been having very uncomfortable conversations with neighbors who now understand their behavior patterns. But the consequence that satisfies me most is that they finally understand I'm not someone who can be manipulated, excluded, or taken for granted anymore. They learned that actions have consequences, and that someone who cares about you doesn't require you to accept being treated as less valuable than everyone else. Grandpa Sidney gave me more than an inheritance. He gave me a family member who truly saw my worth and was willing to stand up for it even after he was gone. And honestly, that's worth more than any amount of money they could have stolen from me.